Once upon a time, at the heart of Europe, there was a proud and ambitious empire called Germany. Led by a spirited leader, Kaiser Wilhelm, they dreamt of glory and greatness, while optimism ruled the land and the forces of progress seemed to be at their peak. But one day, the dark clouds of conflict approached the once peaceful continent. The wicked shadow of political intrigue and alliance had woven such a complex web that few realms could escape getting stuck, as the Great War would break out, with the powerful and industrious Germans at the center of this conflict. Proud and dutiful, the German people followed their Kaiser into the war with great optimism. Perhaps the final time the Germans would feel such an emotion. The war was gruesome and tense, but the Germans performed much better than anyone could have imagined. Despite being at war with the British, the Russians and the French, all great powers in their own right, and a lack of competent allies, apart from a spunky little kingdom called Bulgaria, the Germans managed to almost break France and push back the Russians to such an extent they had a revolution and left the war. But just as Germany was preparing for their final victory in the fields of France, the Americans came. Every day, tens of thousands of Americans arrived in Europe, and after a southern push and instability made their allies collapse, the Germans too were forced to surrender. The peace deal was gruesome. Territories torn away, economic destruction, military reduction, and political humiliation. Germany was no longer to be a major power, nor integrate into the new world the Entente were building. Germany cried out loudly. So, discontent festered. A new ultra-nationalist ideology took control over the once proud German nation, corrupting its very soul. The new Germany no longer had dreams of greatness, they now had dreams of insanity. No longer would Germany be dragged into a conflict, they would now actively seek it out. After 20 years of peace, the dark clouds of conflict once again approached the once peaceful continent. Germany had sought out new allies, which happened to be their former enemies of Italy and Japan. Japan simply out of their own delusional lust for power, while Italy had been discontent with the outcome of the previous war. But before I can tell you the tale of this conflict, a word from our sponsor. The conflict between Israel and Palestine is arguably the most controversial and politicized in modern history, and it has become hard to find out what's really going on. And that's why I've been using this app and website called Ground News. They combine thousands of articles from all around the world in one place and provide context you can't typically find anywhere else, like political bias, ownership, factuality ratings, and even where in the world this is or isn't being covered. It has become a valuable tool for me personally, and I'm excited to have them sponsor this video. I have recently come across this story on Israeli trauma resurfacing in the wake of Hamas' horrific killings. Over 20 articles have been published on it, and only 5% of those are coming from right-leaning outlets, making this a potential blind spot for anyone who doesn't get their news from these sources. Looking closer at the comparison feature, we can see the differences in how each side is framing it. The left focusing on Israel's commitment to protecting Jews, while the right draws comparisons between Israel's retaliation against Hamas. It's also interesting to see that more than 80% of these sources are coming from high factuality sources, telling me this story may not be that sensationalized. As someone who has to stay up to date on the news for my job and has been educated to look for bias, Ground News has become an amazing tool for me to better understand the news cycle. Go to ground.news/possiblehistory and you can subscribe for less than $1 a month and get 30% off unlimited access. I highly encourage you all to check it out. But back to the video, this war would be gruesome and tense. But the Germans performed much better than anyone could have ever imagined. Despite facing France and Britain, two of the biggest powers on earth, the Germans managed to not just conquer the French, they went on to strike deep into the Soviet Union. But as German victory in Europe seemed assured, the Americans came. The Japanese had dragged the Americans into the conflict, and in a moment of true insanity, the Germans had declared war as well. American steel would supply their allies, and combined with seemingly limitless Soviet manpower, the Germans had to surrender, and the war was over. The peace deal was gruesome. Territories torn away, economic destruction, military reduction, and political humiliation. Germany was no longer to be a single nation, now split between two different worlds. Germany cried out loudly. So, discontent festered. Out of spite, the West would neglect their portion of Germany, even shaving off further territories from the small state. The allure of communism grew ever larger within Germany, until, after 20 years of peace, a contentious election victory, as well as pro-unification revolts, Germany suddenly found itself united under the communists. This new Germany had dreams of utopia, hoping to create the ideal workers' paradise in the most industrial communist state. But the Americans couldn't just accept the loss of Germany, and the dark clouds of conflict once again returned to the continent. An American invasion would restart conflicts, but Germany has found new allies, coincidentally both former enemies. The first was the Soviet Union, the hegemon of the communist world, and the second was China, which dutifully joined the war in hopes of reunifying their own nation as well as Korea. The war would be gruesome and tense, yet the Germans performed much better than expected. Militias held off the Western powers until the Soviets were ready to launch their counteroffensive. The Western democracies, helplessly reliant on American aid, folded to the combined German-Soviet offensive, as even Britain, disillusioned and feeling abandoned by the Americans, sued for peace. But as the communists were broadcasting their victory, the Americans prepared their counteroffensive. After securing the Asian Oceans, the Americans would lock down the Far East and even assist in an invasion of China, which would escalate with massive anti-communist protests. As Soviet forces were shifting east, the Americans prepared for an all-out rush from southern Europe. When the American invasion began, most of the Soviet puppet regimes collapsed and welcomed America as liberators. The Germans and the Soviets fought on bravely, but eventually the communist world would buckle under the pressure. The peace deal was gruesome. Territories torn away, economic destruction, military reduction, and political humiliation. A political union of European democracies would be established, who gained full control over the German states as de facto colonies. Germany cried out loudly. Sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with the 2 videos I release every single week, consider doing so, thank you. So, discontent festered. A new ideology grew within Europe. In a world dominated by America, the new European Union began to feel like they were simply American puppets, and the once proud empires didn't like this one bit. After restoring the German regime to equal status, Germany allied with their former European enemies, seeking to reclaim the global influence they could once wield. France and Italy invaded North Africa, while Britain went on Middle Eastern adventures. America, tired of their role as the global police, simply let it be. But Germany was worried, urging their allies to secure Europe first. In a surprise move, Russia would position themselves as the protector of Eastern Europe against the expansionist West, as the dark clouds of conflict once again raged the continent after 20 years of peace. The Germans performed much better than anyone could have expected, single-handedly conquering most of Eastern Europe. But just as German victory seemed assured, in the Americans came. America had taken control over Crimea after the previous war and simply couldn't accept the German threat to the peninsula. America would join the war. Here, the global adventures of the Allies became the downfall of Europe, as the American Navy came to dominate the oceans and the French and the British lost extreme amount of forces and equipment overseas, allowing the Americans to start invading the European continent. Despite continued German success on the Eastern Front, their faltering allies would see the final, desperate cry for European relevancy ended in defeat. The peace deal was gruesome. Territories torn away, economic destruction, military reduction, and political humiliation. European nationalism would be outlawed, as America seized several territories to keep an eye on the troublesome continent, as Western Europe was completely balkanized. Germany cried out loudly. So, discontent festered as the old forces of nationalism cried for unification of the once destroyed states. And so, after 20 years of peace, the dark clouds of conflict again approached the once peaceful continent. As revolutions rocked the Germanic states of Europe, the German nationalists would seek out new allies, only to realize there is nobody left to find. The conflict that followed can barely be called a war. America had long since prepared for this eventuality and executed Operation Byzantium. All of Western Europe was swiftly occupied, regardless of whether they joined the revolutions, and any revolutionary movement was quickly stamped down upon. By the end of it, there were no peace deals to be had. America simply decided that European independence was too troublesome to be respected. The former great empires of Western Europe were now reorganized simply as American states. Within 2 generations, the European languages had all but died out, as Europe became indistinguishable from the American mainland. And finally, the fires of conflict would burn out on the old continent. But that's where I'll end this video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment to support the content. Subscribe for 2 more videos every single week. To continue watching, click on one of the 2 videos on screen now. Again, thank you all for watching,